Greetings from Denmark, where it is freezing and snowing. And I just checked a weather app, and I see it's 76 degrees and nice in Houston. So enjoy. These are my disclosures, and mainly books for the public that recommend a carbohydrate-modified diet. The first law of thermodynamics, which was originally proposed by Germans in the 1800s, holds that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Applied to body weight gives the familiar equation calorie intake minus expenditure equals calories stored. And for humans and most animals, those calories are stored predominantly, the excess calories are stored predominantly in body fat. Now, this law of thermodynamics, physical principle, has been evoked to explain obesity pathophysiology. For example, the Endocrine Society in the United States said that obesity pathogenesis involves sustained positive energy balance, energy intake greater than energy expenditure. And an expert panel of numerous obesity-related associations said that to achieve weight loss, an energy deficit is required, high evidence strength. Now, I'd like to begin with a provocative statement that, that these assertions are meaningless. They're tautologies that tell us what we already know, that equating a positive energy balance with increased body fat storage is simply a law of physics. It's like equating fever with a positive heat balance. Too much heat in the body, not enough heat out of the body. Now, we know, of course, that for the body to generate a fever, it has to produce more heat than it dissipates. But that law of physics is so obvious, we don't have to inexorably instruct patients in that fact every time we see them in clinic. We don't have to begin textbooks on the pathophysiology of febrile illness with a restatement of this principle. What we need to do to make this more interesting is ask, what is cause and effect? Which comes first? So we need causal directional arrows, not an equal sign. Does the positive energy balance lead to increased body fat? Or alternatively, does increasing body fat storage drive a positive calorie balance? Neither formulation violates the law of energy conservation, but they have radically different implications to understanding the cause and treatment of obesity. Now, the conventional view, which has acquired the name the energy balance model, considers obesity as a failure to control energy balance. The arrows flow from left to right. In our modern food environment, surrounded by ubiquitous, high energy dense, tasty foods, it's easy to take in extra calories. We don't burn those calories off with our sedentary lifestyles. They build up as calorie-rich fuels in the blood, get forced into fat cells, making them anabolic, making them grow. We gain weight and develop obesity. Now, a basic precept of this energy balance model is that all calories are alike to the body, right? You've heard this 1,000 times. All calories are alike. The Endocrine Society review said that the impact of diet on obesity risk is explained largely by its effect on calorie intake, rather than by changes of either energy expenditure or the internal metabolic environment. Stated differently, a calorie is a calorie. And if all calories are alike to the body, then the only way to lose weight is to eat fewer of them or to burn more off with physical activity. Eat less, move more. This notion has guided obesity treatment for more than a century, beginning with the first best-selling diet book of the 1900s, published in the early 1900s by the famous at the time Lulu Hunt Peters, Diet and Health with Key to the Calories. You break up your foods into 100-calorie portions, figure out how many you need for weight maintenance, subtract maybe 5 100-calorie blocks, you start losing weight, and voila, your weight problem will eventually disappear. And the same principle was embodied in the first food guide pyramid of the late 1900s, because fat is the most energy-dense nutrient. it was put at the top. We were supposed to eat it sparingly and instead load up on all of these carbohydrates because they have fewer calories per gram. Other reasons, but mainly that. And now we have a new iteration, energy balance model of the 2000s, which places the focus on modern processed foods. But you can see a lot of these concepts still persist. Energy density, large portion sizes, too much fat, not enough fiber, which dilutes energy density. The new twist here is that it's not just tasty and we can't control ourselves through conscious reasons, but it's acting through food reward, appetite, and sensory processing below the conscious level. But I'd like to argue that this energy balance notion has some awkward anomalies. Anomalies meaning observations which just can't be neatly reconciled with this simple concept of overeating driving obesity. And the first anomaly is simply the persistent failure to control the epidemic, despite a century of calorie counting, calorie restriction, calories on the packages. Anytime you go to the doctor's office for obesity, you're put on a low-calorie diet. Traditionally, you were told to cut back on fat, the most calorie-dense nutrient, and exercise more. Despite that, obesity rates keep going up and up and up. At some point, you have to ask, if we try the same approach 3 different ways or more, and the problem keeps getting worse, maybe we have to reassess the wisdom of our recommendations rather than simply blaming patients and the public for not following our recommendations of calorie restriction. A second anomaly is the rising BMI among genetically stable populations. In the 1960s, the average man weighed about 165 pounds and maintained his weight without excessive food restriction. Didn't require scales and balancing to stay around that weight. Today, the average man weighs about 195 pounds in the US. And if you put him into a locked ward and restricted food intake to force weight down to 165, he'd be ravenously hungry. His energy expenditure would drop. And once let out of the locked ward, most likely his weight would go right back up to 195 pounds. So why is this defended body weight, the weight that we would have been happy at a half a century ago, why is that going up and up and up among genetically stable populations? The energy balance model does not have an explanation for that phenomenon. And the third anomaly is the difficulty compensating for very small effects driving weight gain. Obesity, for most people, develops slowly. It's an imbalance of about 1 gram or 10 calories a day would lead to obesity by middle age, beginning in childhood. And that's less than 1 teaspoon of sugar. The total difference in daily calorie intake between today and the 1970s is 200 calories a day. That's just 1 tall glass of grape juice. Why is it so difficult to compensate for these relatively small effects, even if they're operating through subconscious drives? I mean, adults compensate for all sorts of subconscious rewards and drives, such as illicit sex or drugs or all these other things that we learn not to do through conscious control. Why is it so difficult to just make these small changes to prevent weight gain? And lastly, data suggests the whole notion of overeating may lack a foundation. This slide, from a review by Daria Mosafarian, points out in this line, in this data line right here, what we know, that obesity rates continue to increase since 2000 to today. We're approaching about getting close to 45% obesity rates. And yet, one would think that to continue to drive weight up by this model, we have to be eating more and more and more, both to drive the weight gain and also to maintain the extra energy requirements of a heavier body. Heavier bodies take more energy to maintain and move around. But we're not seeing an increase. In fact, by 2 measures, food disappearance from the food supply and dietary recalls, we see no increase. If anything, there's a statistically significant small decrease in energy intake. And this slide from a opponent of the carbohydrate insulin model provides additional evidence in this regard, but looking at energy expenditure, used doubly labeled water among diverse populations, and found that over the same time period, the last 20 years, energy intake in physical activities is going up. We're exercising more, but our metabolic rate is dropping. And this is a profound, if this is true, this is profound. That the last slide I showed you is we're not eating more. If anything, we're eating less and we're moving more, and obesity rates keep going up. So maybe this whole notion of overeating driving obesity is without foundation. Well, the other possibility, we looked at the energy balance model suggesting overeating is causing obesity, but the other possibility is that the arrows go in the other direction. According to the carbohydrate insulin model, the action isn't on the left side. The left side is the behavioral side, eating, physical activity, and such. The right side is the metabolic side. So the carbohydrate insulin model says that something has triggered our fat cells to take in and hold too many calories, leaving too few calories in the bloodstream, not too many, too few. The brain recognizes that as a metabolic threat, and we get hungry, as eating more is a good way to quickly solve this energy crisis. And we get fatigued because there aren't enough calories staying in the bloodstream to nourish the muscles and for the brain. So we get fatigued and our energy expenditure drops. So what could be driving fat cells to take in too many calories? In other words, a substrate partitioning problem? Well, insulin secretion. This is endocrinology 101. Insulin controls the flow of all of the major metabolic fuels. It promotes deposition of these fuels into muscle, liver, and importantly, fat cells. States of increased insulin action, we know, cause weight gain, and states of decreased insulin action, like type 1 diabetes undertreated, go along with weight loss. And this is a big effect. The Accord trial looked at about 9,000 participants with type 2 diabetes on either intensive or standard glycemic control. Intensive glycemic control involved more drugs, importantly insulin. And there was a massive weight gain. This is 5 kilograms, more than 10 pounds. So just from intensive control. And the study concluded that initiation of thiazolidinediones, which sensitize to insulin, or insulin itself, was the most important medication-related factor associated with weight gain. And so what could be increasing insulin secretion, not if you're in a study, but among the general population? Well, that's nutrition one. All the carbohydrates that flooded into our diet, especially the fast-digesting carbohydrates during the low-fat era. And this includes the total amount of carbohydrate, of which we are eating more, and also the glycemic index of the carbohydrate that characterizes how rapidly that carbohydrate digests and turns into sugar and thus raises blood sugar. So let's have a look at a few studies that examine the physiology here. Beginning with an acute feeding study in which we had 12 adolescents with obesity in a crossover feeding study with a washout period on 3 separate days. They were given admitted to the metabolic ward at Boston Children's Hospital, given breakfasts with identical calories, but differing in glycemic load. Highly processed carbohydrates, so instant oatmeal, versus minimally processed carbohydrates, steel-cut oats, same protein, fat, and carbohydrates, same energy density, versus a vegetable omelet with fruit that had a little more fat and protein and a little less carbohydrate. We measured blood tests and hunger through the morning. Then we gave them the same meal at lunch and monitored voluntary food intake based on how hungry they were. This slide shows what happened to insulin and glucagon during the 5 hours after the breakfast. And as expected, insulin was secreted at much larger amounts after the high glycemic load instant oatmeal compared to the steel-cut oats or the vegetable omelet. Big differences. Areas under the curve of 4 to 2 to 1. Glucagon, we don't think about a lot, but it comes from the pancreas as well, the alpha cells, and it does the opposite of insulin. Whereas insulin promotes fat storage, glucagon pulls calories out of storage, including from the liver. Glucagon prepares the body to transition from feeding to fasting. And glucagon was suppressed after the high glycemic load meal. So excessive anabolic hormone, not enough catabolic hormone, and that's a metabolic double whammy that's really going to drive the calories from the meal into storage. And we see that here. After the initial surge of blood sugar in the first couple hours after the meal, blood sugar comes down into a relatively hypoglycemic range. It's been taken up in the muscle and the liver and in the fat. And so it's not staying around in the bloodstream. And the same thing is true for free fatty acids, non-esterified fatty acids, which are the main metabolic fuel fasting. It was suppressed to a greater degree. The action is not the first hour after you're eating. It's 3, 4, and 5 hours later. And we see that as a counter-regulatory surge. Same calories given at the meal, but epinephrine begins to surge in the late postprandial state as a response to, as a demonstration of the fact that there aren't enough calories in the bloodstream and the brain is getting nervous. And in addition to getting nervous, it makes you hungry. And when subjects were given free access to food following a second meal, they ate hundreds of calories more after the high versus medium or low glycemic meals. Now, this is just a one-day study. We don't know if the effects will persist, but if a small fraction of this effect did persist, it could explain much of the increase in body weight that we've seen as the glycemic load of our diet has increased. Well, next, let's move to an animal model, because in animals, we don't know how well they'll translate, the data will translate to humans, but we can control conditions rigorously. And in this study, we looked at Sprague Dawley rats. They were given identical diets, protein, fat, and carbohydrate, just with either fast or slow digesting starch, amylose versus amylopectin. And we further controlled their feeding to maintain the weight of the groups the same. We didn't want one group to eat more just because, or be criticized that it ate more because it thought one starch was tastier than the other. And we measured body composition using tritiated water at 18 weeks, which is a long time for a rat. That would be like, a couple of years for a human. So this slide shows the change in body weight over the 18 weeks of the trial. And you can see that the two groups were maintained on average, virtually indistinguishable body weights. But to accomplish that, we had to begin to restrict calories on the high glycemic load group. That group began to gain weight excessively. And so what does that suggest? Its metabolism was slowing down. It was gaining more weight on the same food. It means its metabolism was slowing down. So we put it on a diet. We cut back. And so by the end of the 18 weeks, to maintain the weights the same, we wound up feeding the high glycemic load group substantially less. And at the same weight, there was a big difference in body fat. So the animals weighed the same, but the high glycemic index group had 70% more body fat. And since they were the same weight and had more fat, they had less lean tissue. And the results, and I hope that I hope this isn't a lunch meeting for you. This is the one graphic slide. The results speak for themselves. These two animals have the same genetic risk for obesity. These are representative, but it's applied to the whole group. They have the same genetic risk for obesity. They weighed the same. The animal on the left ate more, but had very little body fat and was metabolically healthy. The one on the right ate less, was put on a diet that kept excessive weight gain, but it was a metabolic mess with its belly filled with the highest risk fat depot. And I'm going to argue that this is a prima facie case for a substrate partitioning defect. Decreased energy intake, decreased lean mass, but increased fat mass cannot be explained through the energy balance model. If you're overeating then fat should go up and lean should go up, and energy expenditure should go up, or lean should at least stay the same, not go down. This is a problem with the calories winding up in the wrong place, which is the central presupposition of the carbohydrate insulin model. And this is not a rare finding. In fact, all of these models, animal models of obesity, show weight gain in the with genetic defects or in different feeding conditions. The obesity can occur without increased food intake, either spontaneously or you have to sometimes tease it out in pair feeding. But these are all so animal models of obesity characteristically show metabolic defects. They're not overeating as a primary cause of their weight gain. I sort of sometimes feel like it's that story of the emperor without the clothing. I mean, this is completely inconsistent with the energy balance model. And it is exactly what is predicted by the carbohydrate insulin model. Well, the question is, does it apply to humans? And these are very difficult studies to do on humans. Of course, we can't make genetic defect models in humans, but to study humans for many months or years under metabolic wards, very difficult to do. But there are some studies that pertain to this question. And to begin to address it, we did one of the largest feeding studies ever of macronutrients and metabolism called the Framingham State Food Study, in which we took 164 young adults with high body weight, first put them on a run-in diet where they lost about 10% of their weight. Then we randomly assigned them to high, moderate, or low-carb diets, locking their body weight, just like in the rodent study. We kept the body weights the same to see if we could demonstrate differences in metabolic outcomes. So we locked the body weight at that weight loss point, and then fed them more or less based on their individual needs to keep the weight the same. And during this 20-week test phase, 5 months, we measured energy expenditure by doubly labeled water. The diets were 60-40, 20% carb, 20-40, 60% fat, with protein kept at 20%. And we saw the same changes in metabolic fuels. So the high carb diet, you'd have a surge of calories in the blood compared to the low carb diet for the first hour or so. But then this drop off, the total calories in the blood 3, 4, and 5 hours later was highly significantly lower after the high carb meal. So again, when many studies of hunger look at the first hour or so, but that's not where the action is. It's the late postprandial period. And what about the primary outcome? Well, we saw that either intention to treat or per protocol, these are most people we kept within the 2 kilogram weight range. A few people we couldn't. They were just difficult to control. Maybe there was some more non-compliance in this group. But the results were the same either way. On the high carb diet, energy expenditure tended to go down. On the moderate carb diet, it stayed about the same. On the low carb diet, total energy expenditure went up. And this is a radical finding, if this is real, that at the same weight, the type of calories being consumed are affecting the number of calories being burned. That if this is true, all calories are not alike to the body. And we think that one of the mechanisms may be at the mitochondria. We did in a sub-study, an ancillary study, fat cell biopsies, pre and post in the 3 groups. And we looked at mitochondrial function. These are different measures of mitochondrial function. And so these are fat cells. So fat cell mitochondria, when the fat comes into the cell, it's either going to be stored or burned. If it's not burned, it's going to be stored unless it's released. And we found that the respiratory rate, oxidation in the mitochondria on the low carb diet was significantly faster than it was on the high carb diet, suggesting a fundamental shift in metabolism as a consequence of the type of calories being consumed. Well, what about the long term in humans? That's really the key question, isn't it? Do low-carb diets promote long-term weight loss? And we have a problem of low intensity of the behavioral trials. The meta-analyses actually suggest that all low-fat diets are inferior to higher fat diets, whether they're moderately low-carb, high-fat Mediterranean diets, low-carb, very low-carb, ketogenic are all put together. That's the opposite of what the energy balance model has argued, that fat is very fattening because of its energy density and tastiness. And these meta-analyses show the opposite. The effects are not big, maybe a couple of kilograms. But these are low-intensity trials, and let's have a look at the poster child for these studies, pounds lost. So in this study, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is commonly cited to say that all diets are alike, they took 800 adults, studied for 2 years. That's a lot of people for this kind of a study for long term. Assigned them to 4 diets differing in macronutrients. Carb ranging from 35 to 65%, fat 20 to 40, protein 15 to 25. This isn't as big as you can get, but it's a pretty big difference. And if you can't see something here, then it might not exist. They got individual and group counseling. And the ultimate result was no difference in body weight among any group. The problem is that they did not achieve their targeted dietary goals or anywhere close. The reported maximum intake, this is reported, was less than half of the intended. So the maximum intake for fat, the difference was 9%, and protein 5%. And even these small differences are probably overestimated because they're based on self-report. If you take somebody, you recruit them for a study, you select them, because they say they're going to follow the diet, you tell them to follow a low-fat diet, you give them financial compensation for it, and then you ask them, what are you eating? What are they going to say? A low-fat diet. So that's called social bias, desirability bias. When you look at the biomarkers, very little action. They're all pretty much eating alike. So this is, I would say, a study that demonstrates the difficulty of behavioral change, but it does not fairly test a macronutrient hypothesis. There are a few studies that do this more effectively. They usually involve a feeding component, such as a direct study that was done actually in an Israeli power plant, nuclear power facility, where people went in, the workers went in, and they stayed there all day, and they ate a main meal in the cafeteria of the company, and they could produce significantly different meals, at least for one of their 3 meals. In this study, they compared low-fat, moderate-fat, or low-carb diets, and the low-carb diet was the one where you could eat as much as you want. The others were calorie restricted. And so that should bias against the low-carb study, right? Diets, right? They had very good completion rates. And after 2 years, well, there was much more weight loss on the low-carb, and there was some weight regain. There's going to be some non-compliance. The moderate-fat Mediterranean diet was a little slower, but caught up. And the low-fat diet was substantially worse, floating out there in the Dead Sea. Again, opposite to what would be predicted by the energy balance model. And similarly, in the largest multi-centered study ever done of 8 European countries, the participants lost first 8% of their weight, at least, on a run-in diet, and then were put on either low or high protein and low or high glycemic index for 6 months. So a 2x2 design. And so the lowest glycemic load diet, high protein, low GI, perfect weight loss maintenance, no weight regain over 6 months. That's pretty good. You rarely see that. The high glycemic load diet, low protein, high GI, the most weight regain. And the other 2 in the middle showed intermediate results. That's like a dose response curve that you cardiologists might see with some cardiovascular drug. Rarely see this with nutrition. What about epidemiology? Ecological studies where you compare different countries are confounded by many factors. So yes, it's oftentimes the carbohydrate insulin model is criticized that Typical Asian populations eat a lot of white rice, and they have lower obesity rates. But many people in these societies live by subsistence farming or suffered periodic famine and the like. So this is really, really confounded. This is weak evidence. Cross-sectional studies are also at risk for confounding. Cohort studies are more powerful, but there's still important biases, misreporting, and other issues. So we tried to, with my collaborators at the School of Public Health, we tried to do this as best as possible, prospectively, looking at 3 cohorts that were very well studied, a lot of covariates, over 100,000 men and women, followed up for 24 years with repeated dietary assessments. So we could look at change in diet predicting change in weight through successive 4-year periods, which gives you a lot more power and reduces risk for bias. And we looked at results based on baseline obesity status. And I'm just going to show you the results involving those who had obesity at baseline, because those are the ones who were genetically most susceptible. And we saw huge associations. This is weight gain in kilograms. Remember, multiplied by 2.2 for the pounds per 4-year period based on 100-gram change in these foods. So 100-gram change in total starch, 10 pounds of weight gain in 4 years. Starchy vegetables, potatoes, refined grains, added sugars, and glucose equivalents. These are all highly significant results. The low glycemic load carbohydrates went in the other direction. It's not just that people are going to gain more when they eat more of anything. Whole fruits, they would lose relatively 3 kilos. Whole grains, and actually fructose equivalents, which suggests that, people sometimes focus just on fructose being a uniquely bad actor. We don't see evidence of that here and in other studies as well. And so this is glycemic index and glycemic load. Okay, so lastly, I want to come to the topic of drugs and body weight. Drugs that increase insulin action cause weight gain. This is really well established. Insulin, sulfonylureas, thiazolidinediones for diabetes. Drugs that decrease insulin action cause weight loss, like metformin, SGLT2 inhibitors, and alpha-glucosidase inhibitors. What about the 800-pound gorilla on the block these days, GLP-1 receptor agonists? Opponents of the carbohydrate-insulin model said in a recent paper, despite acutely increasing insulin secretion, GLP-1 receptor agonists are currently the most effective approved medication to treat obesity. So do these medications raise insulin secretion and undermine the carbohydrate-insulin model? Well, in the test tube, GLP-1, as an incretin, does stimulate beta cells to secrete insulin. But that's not all it does. It also has a major effect slowing gastric emptying. And we can see that here. This is one of the seminal studies. Paracetamol's acetaminophen, you measure it in the blood, and it tells you how fast the food is getting out of the stomach. With saline and with GLP-1, you can see that gastric emptying is substantially slower. And if the food is getting out of the stomach slower, what's that going to do to insulin? It's going to lower it. Look how radically lower insulin is after the same meal with GLP-1. GLP-1, so in a real life context, GLP-1 in a physiological setting, not a laboratory, but where people are eating mixed meals, which people do, GLP-1 does not raise insulin. It lowers insulin markedly, and this effect is persistent. There's some tachyphylaxis to the gastric emptying, but even at 12 weeks and longer, GLP-1 slows gastric emptying and lowers insulin. And there are all these case reports in the surgical literature now of people who fasted for 24 hours on GLP-1, and they show up for surgery and they can't go through the procedure because their stomach is still full of food. So that's, demonstrating that even when people are on this drug for months, their gastric emptying is slower. So GLP-1 is an incretin, but its actions are consistent with the carbohydrate insulin model, not the opposite. So I've told you that the processed carbohydrates that have flooded our diet during the low-fat years have increased insulin secretion, and that's driven fat cells into a feeding frenzy. They're taking in too many calories. There aren't enough for the rest of the body. The brain recognizes that, makes us hungry. We eat more. Our energy expenditure declines. And from this perspective, weight gain causes the positive energy balance, not the other way around. But this isn't a single nutrient, single hormone model. It's an infrastructure for understanding how many other factors in the diet, prebiotics, probiotics, micronutrients, sleep, stress, physical activity, and endocrine disruptors could be driving obesity, not because they're getting through the blood-brain barrier and making us somehow hungry, but through metabolic effects on fat cells. We've proposed a full model in American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. We paid the big open access fees, so you can download the article freely, read about it, and we have all of our hypotheses there. This is a model. It's not proven, but we have testable hypotheses, which is what a model is supposed to do. And ultimately, we need high-quality research. To produce, as I indicated before, to produce obesity by age 50 requires the storage of just 1 extra gram a day of fat. So these short metabolic ward studies, 2 weeks, what are you going to learn in these very short studies? So we need feeding studies that are long enough to allow for adaptation to change in macronutrients, at least a month, probably longer. And they must, if they're crossover, they must have washout periods. Otherwise, you're going to get fatal carryover effects. We need behavioral trials that are at least a year, but they have to be intense, helping people to make persistent changes in their diet. If you don't change the diet, just like if you do a drug study, people don't take the drug, you can't test the drug's efficacy. And cohort studies, ideally beginning in childhood with a mechanistic focus. And lastly, I'd like to say that the ideas I presented today may be provocative, but they're not new. This was written in a major medical journal. One of the causes of hyperinsulinism, and hypoglycemia is the excessive ingestion of glucose-forming foods, and that as a result of the overactivity induced by overeating, the beta cells, islets of Langerhans, become exhausted and diabetes follows. It is possible that the hunger incident to hyperinsulinemia may be a cause of overeating and therefore the obesity that so often precedes diabetes, right? This is what I've been telling you. That getting fat drives hunger. Insulin driving fat cells makes us hungry. And this was written in 1 century ago by Ceil Harris, who's a colleague of Frederick Banting. So these ideas have been around for a while. Thank you for your attention. And I think we can come off of screen sharing and turn it back to you for questions.